Hi guys, welcome back to Anatomy and Physiology, and we're going to be starting 2.6, which is Endocrine, Reproductive, Nervous System, and Special Senses. And this very first lecture for our Veterinary Technician Online Review course will be the endocrine system. So the endocrine system works together with the nervous system to maintain homeostasis within the body. The primary function of the endocrine system is to produce hormones, and these hormones act on specific target cells that produce a specific effect in the body. So the hormone itself, it's a chemical messenger produced by the endocrine gland and secreted directly into the blood vessels so that it can be carried to its area that it needs to go to. It produces effects when they find their specific receptors in or on a cell. So within that location of where that hormone needs to travel, there's going to be a cell there with a specific receptor on it. And on this picture down here, you can see this target cell that has a special receptor for a special hormone. And once that hormone connects to that receptor, it's then going to give the desired effect. A cell that has a receptor for a particular hormone is referred to as a target cell. So you can see down here the red that's getting spit out of that secreting cell, that red dot is a hormone. So it makes its way all the way down to the area where it needs to have effect. And then the target cell is going to be waiting there to grab onto that hormone to then cause the desired effect. So the control of hormone secretion, how does our body control that? And it actually works in a negative feedback system. So when the level of a specific hormone drops below the required level in our bodies, the appropriate endocrine gland is then stimulated to produce more hormones. For example, if we're talking about a thyroid hormone or a thyroid in a dog, if the thyroid hormone in that dog's body drops below the level that it needs to be, the endocrine gland is then going to be stimulated to produce more hormone to maintain that level. Now, obviously, I'm talking about a nice, healthy thyroid. Once the proper hormone level is present in the bloodstream, stimulation of that endocrine gland is reduced and the production of that hormone is reduced, okay? So once that dog's body recognizes that there's more than enough thyroid hormone, which is at the level that we want it to be, that endocrine gland is then going to reduce its production of that hormone because we're good. The medulla of the endocrine gland, so this is the outer portion of the endocrine gland, uses a different system and simply gets direct stimulation from the nervous system. So there are certain endocrine glands that it doesn't necessarily have to go through that whole negative feedback system. It's just the medulla itself is stimulated from the nervous system to excrete those hormones. For example, the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight reaction. So within our body, there's going to be a certain amount of epinephrine. And this, like adrenaline is another word for epinephrine. So obviously, if I'm being chased by a bear, my body is the only way that it's going to produce more epinephrine to give me the strength I need to run is going to be by the endocrine gland, not relying on this negative feedback system, but more so just knowing my sympathetic nervous system kicks in, I go into fight or flight mode, and the medulla of the endocrine gland just automatically starts spitting out that epinephrine. It's not going to wait for some kind of negative feedback, like my body's going to say, oh, I got too much, or oh, I don't have enough. It's just going to be like, listen, we need to run like heck, and I need the epinephrine to make this happen. So the medulla, so the outer layer of that endocrine gland, of the adrenal gland, is just going to spit it out, just thanks to the nervous system stimulation. So here's a list of the major endocrine glands. We have anterior pituitary gland and a posterior pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland has two sections to it. So it's going to have an anterior and a posterior portion, and they both have different functions. There's going to be a thyroid gland, which is located in the neck area, as well as the parathyroid, which are located directly on the thyroid. We have the adrenal glands, which has a cortex and a medulla, so an inside layer and an outside layer. Our pancreas actually has endocrine function, and it's the inlet cells, or I think that's how you pronounce that word. I'm going to call it inlet, but please forgive me if that's not the proper pronunciation. And those cells have endocrine function. And then the gonads, whether it be testes or ovaries. So, we just listed all of the endocrine glands, but this hypothalamus, it should be mentioned because it plays a huge role in the endocrine system, except for it's not considered an endocrine gland because it's actually an organ. It's a part of the diencephalon section of the brain, so it is considered an organ and not a gland. That's why it's not considered a part or one of the endocrine glands, but it still plays a huge role in the endocrine system. It controls the activities of the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus is what tells the pituitary gland what to do. The portal system, which are tiny blood vessels, links the hypothalamus with the anterior portion of the pituitary gland, and that's how it communicates. So this right here is a beautiful diagram showing you the hypothalamus. So over to the left here, we're looking at the brain, and the hypothalamus is just right here. Okay, so it's just a small section of the brain here, and then hanging down from it, I say hanging, I don't even know if this hangs, but maybe I say that because it looks like testicles, doesn't it? This is the pituitary, and it really does look like testicles, and I always visualize it as dangling in the brain, which it probably doesn't do at all. But either way, the hypothalamus is up here, and then it leads down into this scrotal sac looking structure, which is actually a pituitary gland, and that is what organizes and controls every single endocrine gland in the body. So the hypothalamus has modified neurons there's modified neurons in the hypothalamus that secrete releasing and inhibiting factors into the portal blood vessels. And remember, the portal blood vessels is what is the communication between the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. It's the blood vessels, and it's specific for a particular anterior pituitary hormone. Okay, so the hypothalamus is going to release hormones into the pituitary gland that's going to kickstart the pituitary gland to release those particular hormones. And then that hormone will leave the pituitary gland, find its way to its target organ and the target cells, and create the proper effect. So the modified neurons in the hypothalamus also secrete antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. So the hypothalamus is going to be what produces these two hormones, and it's transported to the posterior pituitary gland for storage. So even though these two hormones are produced in the hypothalamus, they do make their way down to the posterior pituitary gland, and it stores these two hormones. And that is the job of the posterior pituitary gland, is just to store these two hormones. And it's released into the bloodstream by nerve impulses from the hypothalamus when the body needs it, right? So this picture here shows you that the hypothalamus is producing these two, and they make their way down to the posterior pituitary gland for storage. So let's talk about the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland is also called the hypophysis, and it's two separate glands with different structures, functions, and embryological origin. Okay, so the anterior and the posterior pituitary glands have a lot of differences going on. The anterior pituitary gland, which is also called the adenohypophysis, is the rostral portion. Remember, the word rostral means down. It's a directional term that means going down towards the nose or the muzzle of the animal. So that's going to be the rostral portion. It's closer to the nose of the patient. It's stimulated by the hypothalamus and direct feedback from target organs and tissue to produce its hormones. And it produces a wide variety of hormones, which we're going to talk about. And then the posterior pituitary gland, which is also called the neurohypophysis. And this is the caudal portion of the pituitary gland. So it's behind the anterior. And it stores and releases the hormones produced in the hypothalamus. And remember, those two hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus is oxytocin and the antidiuretic hormone. So the anterior pituitary gland, and it has, these are known hormones that are produced by the anterior pituitary gland, and we're going to talk about every single one of these, okay? So it has a much bigger role than the posterior pituitary gland. It produces growth hormones, prolactin, thyroid-stimulating hormones, adrenal corticotropic hormone, also ADH, follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and melanocyte-stimulating hormone. So we're going to go through each one of those. So first of all, the growth hormone, which is also called a somatotropin and a somatotropic hormone, it promotes body growth in young animals. And it helps regulate the metabolism of protein, carbohydrates, and lipids in all of the body's cells. Prolactin helps trigger and maintain lactation. So secretion of milk by the mammary gland, that's what lactation is. So prolactin production and release continues as long as the teat or the nipple continues to be stimulated by nursing or milking. So for example, dairy cattle, prolactin will come about once the mother has given birth. I wonder if a little bit is produced a little bit beforehand because there can be some lactation that may happen before before they give birth. Either way, prolactin, they give birth. This hormone will continue to be secreted as long as those teats are stimulated to produce milk. That's why dairy farmers will connect their milking machines to them and they'll be able to milk them for long periods of time because as long as they're stimulating those teats, the prolactin hormone will be formed from the anterior pituitary gland, causing that help trigger and maintain that lactation. So when prolactin stimulation stops, milk production will stop, and the mammary gland shrinks back to its non-lactating size. This here is a diagram just showing you how the anterior pituitary gland will produce prolactin, which will stimulate the milk letdown for a mother. And it's thanks to the suckling of this baby that's causing that prolactin to be released and help that milk production. So thyroid-stimulating hormone is also known as the thyrotropic hormone. It stimulates growth and development of the thyroid gland and causes it to produce its hormones. So the thyroid gland produces hormones itself, and thanks to the thyroid-stimulating hormone, it can do that. So secretion is regulated by feedback from the thyroid gland, just like that example that I gave you a few slides ago with a healthy dog with a healthy thyroid. The thyroid has to produce a certain amount of thyroid hormone. Once that thyroid hormone gets lower than our body needs, the anterior pituitary gland will produce TSH, so thyroid stimulating hormone, which will stimulate that thyroid to step its game up and start producing a little bit more so that we can get to that threshold that our body needs. So it has a direct effect on the anterior pituitary gland through changes in the TSH releasing factor produced by the hypothalamus. So again, the hypothalamus often regulates everything that the pituitary gland does, and there's a TSH releasing factor that's produced by the hypothalamus that will then stimulate the anterior pituitary gland to release the TSH, which will then find its way to the thyroid hormone, which will then produce thyroid hormones. This here is showing you how TSH works. So the hypothalamus will produce thyroid releasing hormones, which will cause the pituitary to release TSH, which will go directly to the thyroid gland and stimulate it to produce its hormone, which is actually T4 and T3. Those are two different types of thyroid hormones. The next one is adrenocorticotropic hormone. Sorry, I said that this was labeled as ADH. That's the antidiuretic hormone. I apologize. The adrenocorticotropic hormone is actually labeled as ACTH. Okay, so it's this ACTH stimulates growth and development of the adrenal cortex and also releases some of its hormones. So it's regulated by feedback by the adrenal hormones. Okay, so when it drops too low, the negative feedback thing will happen. ACTH can also be released quickly as a result of stimulation by the hypothalamus by other parts of the brain. Okay, so the hypothalamus sends a burst of ACTH releasing factors to the anterior pituitary gland through the portal system, causing ACTH to be released quickly. So again, ACTH stimulates that adrenal gland to produce its hormones. This right here is showing you how ACTH works. The pituitary gland will send ACTH down to the adrenal gland, and then after that, the adrenal gland will produce cortisol is one of its hormones that it would produce. Follicle stimulating hormone, which is labeled as FSH, in the female FSH stimulates the growth and development of ovarian follicles, which is responsible for oogenesis, which is the production of the egg in the female. It also stimulates cell lining in the follicle to produce and secrete estrogen. So again, that follicle on that ovary will produce a hormone called estrogen, and that's all thanks to FSH being produced by the anterior pituitary gland. In the male, FSH stimulates spermatogenesis, which is the production of sperm in the testes of the male. We have a luteinizing hormone, again, plays a role on the reproductive system of male and females. It completes the process of follicle development in the ovary. So increasing amounts of estrogen feed back to the anterior pituitary gland. Because remember, the FSH caused the follicle to form on the ovary of the female, and within that follicle, there's going to be cells that's going to be making that estrogen. So there's going to be an increased amount of estrogen that's going to make its way back up to the pituitary gland. There's going to be then a decreased production of FSH and increased production of LH. So again, it's just that anterior pituitary gland realizing that, okay, you know what, there's a really huge increase of estrogen here. I'm going to stop doing what I got to do, and luteinizing hormone is going to kick in and do what it has to do. LH levels reach a peak when the follicle is fully mature, and that's when ovulation happens in the female. Continuing on with luteinizing hormone, after ovulation, the luteinizing hormone stimulates cells in the empty follicle to multiply and develop into the corpus luteum. When we get into the reproductive system, hopefully it will bring back what all these mean, but the follicle will rupture, release its egg, and turn into almost what looks like a little bit of scar tissue, and that's called the corpus luteum. So this corpus luteum, or CL body, which is sometimes what is referred to as, produces progestin hormones necessary for the maintenance of pregnancy. So if that female happens to ovulate and get pregnant successfully, that CL body is going to stay there, and it's going to maintain the progestin that's necessary during that pregnancy. So it won't allow the estrogen to peak back up again and the follicle to form and the release of an egg. That's not going to happen thanks to the CL body. In males, the luteinizing hormone stimulates interstitial cells to develop and produce testosterone within the testicle. Sometimes you'll hear a term called gonadotropins, and what that is simply the luteinizing hormone and the follicle stimulating hormone, and how it all works together. So we can see here how the endocrine system will release the follicle stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone, and they work together to create spermatogenesis and oogenesis. And testosterone and progesterones, of course. Melanocyte-Stimulating hormone. So this one is the last hormone that we're going to talk about with the anterior pituitary gland. It's associated with the color change in the pigment cells. The melanocytes of the reptiles, fish, and amphibians. So these animals can change colors and patterns quickly, and it's thanks to the melanocytes, so the pigment cells within their skin, and it's all controlled by a melanocyte-stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary. Administration of artificially large amounts of melanocyte-stimulating hormone to higher mammals can cause darkening of skin from melanocyte stimulation. So this right here is just showing you the melanocyte within the skin and melanin and where it's located there. So now that we talked about the anterior pituitary gland, let's go back to the posterior pituitary gland. It stores two hormones, like we said, produced by the hypothalamus. We have the antidiuretic hormone, ADH, and oxytocin. It's transported from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary gland and stored in the nerve endings of the posterior pituitary gland. Periodically, it's released into the bloodstream in response to nerve impulses from the hypothalamus. So the antidiuretic hormone that's produced from the hypothalamus and stored in the posterior pituitary gland helps prevent diuresis. Okay, so receptors in the hypothalamus detect changes in the osmotic pressure of blood that results from dehydration and hemoconcentration. And it generates a nerve impulse, causing the release of the ADH that's being stored in the pituitary gland. So the ADH will travel to the kidneys and cause the kidneys to resorb more water from the urine and return it back to the bloodstream because we're dehydrated. So ADH deficiency causes diabetes insipidus, amazingly enough. So when you think about how this happens, think about at nighttime when you're sleeping. Let's say you sleep for 10 hours. You're not going to be drinking any water, so naturally your body slightly dehydrates when you're sleeping. But thanks to this antidiuretic hormone, we're not going to die and shrivel up or have to be hospitalized because of this dehydration. Because as we're sleeping, what happens is that the hypothalamus is going to detect these changes. It's going to say, wait a minute, and it determines the osmotic pressure in the blood, and that's how it determines that there's dehydration happening here. So the hypothalamus is going to say, wait a minute, we're dehydrating here and I can't let that happen. So it generates a nerve impulse and then to the posterior pituitary gland where it's being stored, that ADH, and then it'll spit the posterior pituitary gland will spit out that ADH. That ADH will make its way down to the kidneys because typically we would just pee out our fluid, right? And so that ADH is going to tell the kidneys, wait a minute, we're dehydrating here. You can't pee out this water. You need to resorb it back and put it back into our bloodstream so that we don't become clinically ill because of this dehydration. And that's why when you go take your first morning urination, it's darker, okay? Because the water was taken out of it and used in your body to help maintain that hydration. And that's why your urine is darker first thing in the morning, thanks to the ADH. So this right here is just showing you how the antidiuretic hormone works at the kidney level. So this picture may make more sense when we go through the nephron, but this here is a tubule, a convoluted tubule in the nephron, and that's where things get absorbed and reabsorbed and secreted from the kidney, from the blood into urine or reabsorbed back into the blood. So there's capillaries that are going to be wrapping its way all the way around this tubule in the kidney. And so the peritubular capillary is going to have that ADH that the posterior pituitary gland spit out. And then this tube is going to say, uh-oh, this ADH is telling me I'm not allowed to have this water. So it'll take the water and bring it back out into the peritubular capillary where it's going to make its way through the body again so that it doesn't get dumped out into the urine because our body needs it to stay hydrated. So the second type of hormone produced by the posterior pituitary gland is the oxytocin. It has effects on the uterus. It causes contractions of the myometrium at the time of breeding and at parturition. So it induces uterine contractions that aid in the transport of spermatozoa to the oviducts. So it's said that oxytocin will help during copulation. The female's uterus will contract, which will help with bringing that spermatozoa up to the oviduct so that it can find its way to the egg. It also stimulates uterine contractions that aid in the delivery of the fetus and the placenta. So thanks to that oxytocin, we're able to deliver the baby. And oxytocin can be obviously naturally produced in our body thanks to this posterior pituitary gland in the endocrine system, but it also can be synthetically given. A lot of animals that are in dystocia and they can't pass their fetuses, they will be given synthetic oxytocin to help that uterine contraction to get them out. So it has effects on active mammary glands as well. It causes the movement of milk down to the lower parts of the gland. So it helps with milk letdown. Stimulation of the teat or nipple by nursing or milking causes oxytocin to be released into the bloodstream, as well as the prolactin. Remember, we talked about that. It causes contractions of the myoepithelial cells around the mammary gland, alveoli, and the small ducts, and then it forces the milk down into the lower parts of the gland so that it can be taken by the pup. There's also other glands of the endocrine system, okay? So we're not talking about all the glands that we just listed, but other glands or even organs within the bodies that help the endocrine system. So the thyroid gland itself, it consists of two lobes on either side of the larynx, and the thyroid hormone is produced in the follicles, which are simple cuboidal glandular cells. And this is the location of the thyroid gland in a dog. The thyroid hormone that's produced is T3 and T4. It's produced when TSH from the anterior pituitary gland reaches the thyroid gland. T4 is produced in greater abundance than T3, but is mostly converted to T3 before producing effects on its target cells. So what do thyroid hormones do? It influences the development and maturation of the central nervous system, so growth and development of muscle and bones as well. Calorigenic effects, so it regulates the metabolic rate of all body cells and allows animal to generate heat and maintain constant internal body temperatures. That's why with hyperthyroidism and hypothyroidism, you'll have cold intolerance or heat intolerance. So production increases with exposure to cold and then increases metabolic rate to generate more heat, affects metabolism of proteins, carbs, lipids, kind of like the growth hormone does as well. Another hormone produced by the thyroid, besides the T4 and the T3, is calcitonin, and it's produced by the C cells located between the thyroid follicles, which is where the thyroid hormone is produced, helps maintain blood calcium levels, prevents hypercalcemia by encouraging excess calcium to be deposited in the bones. Okay, so hypercalcemia, so that's increased calcium in the blood. So it prevents hypercalcemia by encouraging this excess calcium to make its way to the bones and just hang out in there. The calcium is involved in muscle contractions, blood clotting, milk secretion, and formation and maintenance of the skeleton. So this is just a picture showing you that don't forget that calcitonin is a part of the hormones released by the thyroid. It's not just thyroid hormones. And that's, remember I said that the parathyroid hormone lies within the thyroid, and you can see for those nodules there, the parathyroid hormone is the parathyroid. So parathyroid hormone is also called parathormone, and it's produced by the parathyroid glands, which we just saw in that last picture. They're small pale nodules in or on or near the thyroid gland. They help maintain blood calcium levels, so they prevent hypocalcemia. They cause the kidneys to retain calcium and intestine to absorb the calcium from the food, and also withdraws calcium from bones. So thanks to these parathyroid hormones, if ever we do become low in calcium, the parathyroid gland will cause the removal of calcium from our bones. And that's why when women, it's most often spoken of in women when they become older and they start losing calcium in their blood, their bones, or sorry, when they start becoming hypocalcemic, which is low calcium in the blood, the parathyroid hormone will, and the parathormone will actually take the calcium out of the bone, causing very brittle bones. That's why it's very important to maintain the proper calcium levels in your body. This here is just showing you, if there's low concentration of calcium in the blood, there's going to be a release of parathormone from the parathyroid hormone. It will remove calcium from the bones. It'll decrease the calcium lost in the urine, so it'll actually resorb that calcium and enhance absorption of calcium from the intestine. And those are three ways that the parathormone will help increase blood calcium levels. So the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands are located near the cranial end of the kidney. They consist of two glands, so one on each consists of two glands. It's weird that so there's two adrenal glands, right and left, and they're composed of an adrenal cortex, which is the outer layer, and the adrenal medulla, which is the middle layer. And this picture shows you where they're located. So this right here shows you the adrenal cortex being the outer layer and the adrenal medulla, which is the inside layer. The adrenal cortex itself produces numerous steroid hormones classified into three main groups, okay? So these steroids that are produced by our adrenal gland, our adrenal cortex specifically, are glucocorticoids, mineralocorticoids, and sex hormones, okay? Those are the three groups of hormones that are produced by our adrenal gland. The glucocorticoids that are produced by our adrenal cortex is a steroid hormone. Okay, like we said, these are all three of them are steroid hormones. And there's different types of glucocorticoids like cortisone, cortisol, and corticosterone. They have hyperglycemic effects, and they also help maintain blood pressure and help the body resist the effects of stress. Mineralocorticoids, which are produced by the adrenal gland, an example of that is aldosterone, and it regulates the levels of important electrolytes, which are just mineral salts in our body. And the last one, which are sex hormones, which are called androgens, stimulate or control the development and maintenance of the male characteristics, and also that's specifically the definition for androgens. It stimulates the male characteristics, and then also the estrogen. So the medulla, that was the adrenal cortex, the medulla, which is the middle layer, produces epinephrine, which is also termed as adrenaline, but we use the term epinephrine, and norepinephrine, which is also a stress hormone. So secretion is controlled by the sympathetic portion of the autonomic nervous system. So this doesn't have anything to do with the pituitary gland and the negative feedback system. This just has to do with the nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system, specifically in the fight or flight response. So this adrenaline or epinephrine will increase heart rate and output, increase blood pressure, dilate air passages in the lungs, and decrease GI function. We often talk about the sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight, and what it does to our body, and it brings all the blood circulation to areas that need to work the hardest, like our muscles, because we're going to be running for our lives, our respiratory tract, because we're going to have increased respiration, and our cardiac output as well. The pancreas. So it's located near the duodenum. We talked about the pancreas during the digestive PowerPoint, and it has both exocrine and endocrine function. Okay, so the exocrine function is that it spits out digestive enzymes, the amylase, lipase, and trypsin. I do believe those were the three digestive enzymes, and those are secreted into the duodenum to help with digestion. But it does also have endocrine function, and basically the endocrine component is a small percentage of the total volume of the organ so a small percentage of this pancreas has endocrine components to it, and it's actually the pancreatic islets. Again, please excuse my pronunciation if it's wrong. And these are a group of cells that are scattered throughout the pancreas. And there's alpha cells, beta cells, and delta cells. So alpha cells produce glucagon. We're going to talk about all these. Beta cells, which produce insulin, and delta cells, which produce somatostatin. So when it produces insulin itself lowers blood glucose levels by causing glucose, amino acids, and fatty acids to be absorbed into the body's cell. Okay, so insulin, which is produced by the pancreas, lowers blood glucose. Then it produces something called a glucagon, which increases blood glucose levels. So it's the absolute opposite of insulin. So it increases blood glucose levels by stimulating liver cells to convert glycogen to glucose and by stimulating glucogenesis. So glucagon is the absolute opposite of insulin. So if my blood sugar, for example, goes really high, I just ate a 5-pound cookie, and my blood sugar goes way up, my pancreas is going to say, wait a minute, we're hyperglycemic, this can't happen, so it's going to spit out insulin, okay, which is a hormone that's going to decrease my blood glucose level to acceptable levels. If, for example, I become really hungry and I haven't eaten in like 24 hours and my blood sugar level is going really, really low, my pancreas is going to say, wait a minute, we're hypoglycemic here and I can't let this happen. So it's actually going to secrete a hormone called glucagon, which is going to help increase my blood glucose levels to acceptable levels. And then somatostatin inhibits secretion of insulin and glucagon and growth hormone, and also diminishes GI activity. So moving down to the reproductive tract, the testes, there's actually interstitial cells, and these are clumps of endocrine cells, okay? And they produce androgens, which is a group of male hormones, when stimulated by the luteinizing hormone, okay? So that's its endocrine function in the testes. So within the testicle itself, there are interstitial cells. Interstitial, so it means in between the tissues. In the testes, there are cells, and these are actually a group of endocrine cells, and they produce androgens, which is male hormones, like for example testosterone, right? And it produces androgens when it's stimulated by the luteinizing hormone from that anterior pituitary gland. Testosterone is the primary androgen. It controls the development of male secondary sex characteristics and accessory sex glands. And also testosterone will activate spermatogenesis, which is the creation and the making of sperm. Ovaries are the female gonad. The ovaries itself produce an ova and hormones in cycles, and it's controlled by the follicle-stimulating hormone as well as the luteinizing hormone. We talked about that when we were talking about FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary gland. Hormone groups produced in the ovaries is their estrogens, estrogen and progestin, which is produced by that ovary. Estrogen, so follicle-stimulating hormone, stimulates the ovarian follicle to develop. The follicular cells produce and release estrogen, so that's where estrogen comes from. The amount of estrogen produced increases as the follicle grows. The increase in estrogen, though, will remember what it does. That increase in estrogen will make it so that the blood estrogen level is going to go up, and the pituitary gland is going to realize that and stop production of FSH and start the production of LH, which is going to cause that follicle to finish its maturation, rupture, spit out the egg, and then a CL body is going to be produced. Increasing estrogen levels accelerate physical and behavioral changes as well. Feedback to the anterior pituitary gland, this is what I just said on the other slide, causes pituitary gland to reduce the production of FSH and increase LH. When the follicle is fully mature, the LH levels will peak. In most animals, this is when ovulation happens. Progestins, a group of hormone produced by the corpus luteum. So we know that the follicle in the ovary produces estrogens, and now the corpus luteum will produce a hormone which are progestins. So high luteinizing hormone levels stimulate the cells of an empty follicle to multiply and develop into a corpus luteum. Progesterone, which is the principal progestin, helps prepare the uterus to receive the fertilized ovum, and it's needed to maintain pregnancy. In a pregnant female, a hormone signal is sent from the uterus and the corpus luteum is maintained, okay? So that means that the follicle will not come back and the estrogen will not then start to spike in the blood. It just won't happen because the CL body is going to be maintained on that ovary. If no pregnancy occurs, the lack of a hormone signal causes the corpus luteum to shrink and then disappear. And this right here is your CL body. I keep referring to it as kind of like scar tissue from that follicle. Like the follicle is like a big bubble that bursts, and then the egg is released, and then a CL body is formed, and that's what it looks like there. So other endocrine organs, none of these are considered glands, but nonetheless very important with the endocrine system. Our kidneys. We talked about this, or at least we're going to during the urinary system. They produce erythropoietin. So this is a hormone that stimulates red bone marrow to increase production of red blood cells. We did talk about this during, I think, the skeletal system when we were talking about that red bone marrow. But nonetheless, kidneys do produce a hormone, even though they are not an endocrine gland. They have endocrine functions, and it's by producing this hormone called erythropoietin, and it stimulates the bone marrow to make red blood cells. production of erythropoietin is stimulated by hypoxia. So it has this, although it has endocrine function, it's not stimulated by the pituitary gland like most endocrine glands are. What actually stimulates this is hypoxia. So we have low oxygen going in our blood. Our body recognizes that and knows that we need more red blood cells circulating so that we can have the proper amount of oxygen circulating in our body. Because you have to remember that every single cell in our body has a function. And to be able to carry out that function, it needs oxygen to feed it and give it energy so that it can do what it's got to do. If we're lacking oxygen, there's going to be certain cells in our body that aren't going to be getting the right amount of oxygen, and they're just going to die. And that's really bad. And that's called poor perfusion. So when we don't have the right amount of blood circulation going to a certain area, either because of maybe blood pressure and it's just not making its way there, or perhaps it's anemia, it's a lack of red blood cells, and there's just not as much oxygen traveling through our system than there should be, and these systems and these cells aren't getting the right amount of oxygen. So our kidneys can't let that happen. So when they do recognize that hypoxia, they're going to start producing the hormone erythropoietin, which is then going to stimulate that red bone marrow to produce red blood cells. Therefore, they can carry the right amount of oxygen to our tissues. So as the red blood cell production increases, more oxygen feeds back to the kidney. And then obviously the kidney will then recognize, okay, our hypoxia is correcting itself. Let's slow down this production of erythropoietin. The stomach produces hormones, okay? It produces something called gastrin, and this is produced by the cells in the wall of the stomach. Secretion is stimulated by the presence of food in the stomach, and it stimulates gastric glands to secrete hydrochloric acid and digestive enzymes, which is very necessary for the digestion of food. Encourages muscular contraction of the stomach wall as well, which is going to help turn that food and turn it into that mass that can then move down to the duodenum for absorption. The small intestine, it secretes hormones called secretin and cholecystokinin, are produced by cells in the lining of the small intestine. The secretion occurs in response to the presence of chyme in the duodenum. So chyme is that bolus of food that has come out of the stomach and made its way into the small intestine for nutrient absorption. Secretin stimulates the pancreas to secrete fluids to neutralize the acidic chyme after it passes out of the stomach. So you have to keep in mind all that acid in that stomach, the hydrochloric acid that's produced by the stomach, it's very acidic, obviously, and it helps with the breakdown of food. And the reason why that hydrochloric acid doesn't chew through the stomach lining is because there's a certain mucus barrier in that stomach that helps prevent that. But our small intestines don't have that. So there is this mechanism that happens that when that acidic bolus of food from the stomach comes out, secretin is going to stimulate the pancreas to secrete a fluid in there that's going to neutralize that acid. And cholecystokinin stimulates the pancreas to release the digestive enzymes into the duodenum and stimulates the gallbladder to release bile. So we talked about the exocrine function of the liver and gallbladder as well as the pancreas. And the pancreas will spit out digestive enzymes that will digest fat and proteins and all those different things. And then the bile will also then be secreted within the duodenum or the small intestine to help digest fat. So these are all digestive enzymes. And thanks to cholecystokinin, those are secreted by the pancreas and the gallbladder. The placenta. The placenta itself surrounds the developing fetus during pregnancy. It acts as an interface with the maternal circulation. During the cardiovascular PowerPoint, we talked about how that happens. It produces hormones to help support and maintain pregnancy. So estrogen and progesterone are hormones that are produced, and chorionic gonadotropin in some species. The thymus. This is kind of a funny one because it's not always talked about or considered a part of the endocrine system, but because it disappears in older animals. But it extends cranial from the level of the heart up into the neck region along both sides of the trachea, so similar to the thyroid. It's very large in young animals, but it atrophies later in life and then turns into just a fatty mass and has no function. So the function involves hormones and hormone-like chemical substances like thymosin and thymopoietin. So this is produced in that thymus in young animals and seems to cause certain cells to be transformed into T lymphocytes. But from what I understand, the thymus and its functions are very, the knowledge of its function is very limited. The pineal body is located at the caudal end of the cleft that separates the two cerebral hemispheres in the brain. You can see this picture up here shows you where it's at. It's very small. It influences cyclic activities of the body, okay? So when you sleep and when you're awake, that's thanks to your pineal body. So melatonin is a hormone-like substance that seems to affect moods and awaken sleep cycles. They also play a role in the timing of seasonal estrus in some species, so it's able to determine what season it is and kickstart their estrogen cycle if they are seasonal. Prostaglandins is important to talk about. Prostaglandins are a group of lipids made at the site of tissue damage or infection. Okay, so wherever there's tissue damage or infection, there's going to be a group of lipids that are going to be made, and those are called prostaglandins. So they're not secreted by a gland and do not travel through the bloodstream. They're produced by a chemical reaction at the site where they are needed and can be made in almost all organs of the body. So involved in dealing with injuries and illness, control processes such as inflammation, blood flow, blood clotting, and it also helps induce labor, and made at the site of tissue damage and infection, like we said, and will cause inflammation and pain and fever to help the animal heal. Influences other things such as blood pressure, the GI, respiratory system, reproductive, and kidney function as well.